Before we start, do yourself a favor and get ready for this one. Turn off the lights, get comfortable, and prepare for some real nightmare fuel. I want to know where you're watching from and what time it is right now where you are, so drop your city and the exact hour down in the comments. And don't forget, this month I'm doing a $2,000 giveaway for subscribers only, so make sure you're subscribed, leave a like, and comment below to be part of it. The relate is the night the beam turned around. I took the job inspecting the decommissioned lighthouse because it came with free housing and I was broke. The town council just needed someone to document structural conditions for a grant, which really meant go live out on a windy rock for a month and take pictures. The first few days were boring in the exact way you'd expect. Seagulls, bad cell signal, pipes that clanged like they hated me. The lantern hadn't worked in years. The whole top of the tower was just dead metal and dusty glass. The night everything went wrong, there wasn't even a storm to blame it on. It was calm, just a flat black ocean and a sky with no stars. I was in the tiny kitchen going through old paperwork when the cabin filled with a faint rotating glow, like someone was sweeping a giant flashlight across the windows. I thought a boat was out there at first. Maybe a trawler cutting too close to shore, so I went outside to check. The beam wasn't coming from a boat. It was coming from the top of the lighthouse. The lantern room, which I'd climbed through earlier that week and confirmed was completely dead, was blazing. A single white beam was rotating slowly over the water, steady and mechanical, just like an operational lighthouse. The air around me was perfectly still, but I could hear the deep, mechanical grind of gears that didn't exist anymore. At first, I was almost relieved. If the light worked, maybe the wiring wasn't as bad as I'd thought. Then I noticed what the beam was actually showing. When it passed over the water, I saw shapes that shouldn't have been there, outlines of ships where the surface had looked empty a second before. Not modern boats, tall masts, broken railings, hulls split open and tilted. On every deck, rows of figures stood motionless, facing the cliff. When the beam moved on, the ocean went back to being just black water. I told myself I was imagining it. I went back inside, shut the door, tried to focus on anything else. But as the beam kept turning, the glow crept around the walls like a slow clock. Every rotation took a little longer, almost like it was hesitating. When it finally swung over the hill and hit the cottage, the whole room flashed white, and I heard something new under the grinding of gears. Voices carrying up from the rocks below. Dozens of them, all yelling the same thing in a hoarse, ragged chorus. "Turn it back, turn it back, turn it back." I grabbed my radio and tried to call the harbor. It crackled to life immediately, but instead of the usual static, a calm, tinny voice spoke my full name. Then it repeated the exact time my boat had dropped me off 3 days earlier, down to the minute, in a tone like it was reading coordinates. After that, just dead air. By then, the beam wasn't sweeping anymore. It had stopped fully, locking in place. My heart dropped when I realized it wasn't pointed over the water anymore. It was pointed straight at the window I was standing in. The light hit my chest like a physical weight. I couldn't move. Every muscle felt pinned in place. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw shadows on the cliff below, clustered together and looking up. I couldn't make out faces, but I could tell their mouths were all open, like they were screaming, even though the sound seemed far away. The last thing I remember before blacking out was feeling my feet slide forward across the floor, even though I wasn't moving them, like something in that beam had hooked into me and started dragging. When I woke up, it was morning. I was sprawled halfway up the path to the lighthouse, gravel dug into my palms. The lantern room above me was dull and dead again. No light, no grinding, no voices. My radio lay a few feet away, screen cracked, battery dead. I hiked back down to the cottage in a fog and found something that still makes my stomach flip when I think about it. On the inside of the front door, at chest height, were 3 long streaks where the paint had been stripped down to raw wood, like someone with wet, rusted fingers had gotten a grip and been dragged away from it. The streaks lined up exactly with where my hands had been when that beam hit me. The relate is the keeper who answered my comment. I run a tiny YouTube channel where I post urban exploration videos, abandoned houses, empty schools, stuff like that. I never faked anything paranormal. If something creepy happened, I left it in. But I wasn't one of those channels planting dolls and jump scares. When an old lighthouse opened its grounds for a limited time historical access thing, I jumped at it. No overnight stays, just daylight hours. I filmed everything, including some B-roll of the keeper's house and the rusted stairs. When I got home, I edited the footage late into the night. Nothing weird happened in the raw clips, just wind noise, my footsteps, the usual. I posted the video around 3 in the morning, scheduled it, and crashed. When I woke up, it already had more comments than usual, mostly locals arguing about old rumors. One comment stood out. The username was just E. Harris, Keeper, with a profile picture that looked like a black and white photo of a man in an old uniform. The comment was polite and oddly formal. It said, "You got the year wrong. They automated us in 72, not 71, and the bedroom you called empty is still occupied. You should check the audio at 1327. You weren't alone in the stairwell." It creeped me out, but I assumed it was a local with a roleplay account. I scrubbed to 1327 out of curiosity. The stairwell clip was boring. Just my sneakers on metal, my breathing, the camera shaking a bit. I put on headphones and cranked the volume. At first I heard nothing, and then under my own footsteps I caught a faint whisper. It was my own voice, but wrong somehow, like it had been recorded in a different room. It said, clear as day, "You shouldn't have come back." I know I never said that. I filmed the whole thing talking to the camera about rust and safety rails, no dramatic lines, and I'd never been there before, so come back didn't even make sense. I clicked on the commenter's profile, planning to DM them and ask if they'd edited their own version or something. The page didn't load. Error. I refreshed. Same thing. When I went back to my video, the comment was gone. The next night I live-streamed for a bit, talking about the trip. Someone in chat asked if I knew the story of the last keeper, a guy named, of course, Harris. They said he'd jumped from the lantern room after weeks of talking to voices in the radio. I figured they were trolling me because of the username and shrugged it off, made a joke, moved on. That should have been the end of it. A week later, I was in bed, half asleep, with a podcast playing on my phone, face down on the pillow. The room was dark, except for the little charging light. Somewhere around 3 again, I woke up to the soft buzz of a notification. I didn't check it. I just rolled over and drifted out again. In that weird in-between state, I heard my own voice whisper right next to my ear, "You got the year wrong." I jolted awake so hard I dropped my phone. The room was empty. My heart was pounding. There was a new notification on the lock screen. YouTube Studio comment alert from the Lighthouse video. I opened it with shaking hands. Same username, same grainy profile picture. The comment said, "Check your footage at 1904. This time, listen to what you said after you switched the camera off." And the problem was, 1904 was after the video cut to black. I hadn't used anything beyond 1830. There shouldn't have been any audio there. But on my SD card, in the raw clip, there was. The camera had kept recording longer than I'd thought, still rolling as I set it down on a windowsill. I heard myself sigh, then the sound of metal as I leaned against the stair railing. And then, in my own voice again, a whisper I have never said in my life. "If you're watching this, I'm back on the stairs. Tell him I don't want to go up again." I stopped going through the footage after that. I took the video down a day later. The last straw was when a viewer sent me a screenshot they'd paused at in the lantern room tour. In the reflection of the glass behind me, you could see 2 figures. Me, holding my camera, and a man in an old uniform standing just over my shoulder, staring straight into the lens. The email's subject line was just, "Is this the keeper?" The body of the email only said, "He looks a lot like the guy in your comments." There was no screenshot attached. The file name showed up, but wherever the image had been was just a grey box with a broken icon. Title, "Static from the Lantern Room." I volunteered with the Coast Guard Auxiliary mostly for the excuse to be around boats. My job was boring. Monitor radio channels, log stuff, call things in if they got weird. Most nights it was fishermen, drunk idiots with flares, and the occasional real emergency. We shared a frequency range with an old lighthouse that had been converted into an automated beacon. Nobody lived there, but the equipment still pinged status bursts every so often. One shift, sometime past midnight, I started picking up this low, crackling static on one of the lesser-used channels. It wasn't like normal interference. It pulsed in this odd rhythm that didn't match weather patterns or any of our equipment. At first, I thought it was some kid playing with a cheap marine radio. Then, underneath the static, I heard a voice. It was tiny, like it was coming from far away and through water. I leaned in, turned the volume up, and every hair on my arm stood up when I realized it was a child's whisper. Turn around. That was it. 2 words. The same words every time the static rolled over in its weird pulse. Turn around. Turn around. I did all the standard checks, asked my supervisor if any training exercises were running, scanned other channels, logged the time. Nothing matched. On a hunch, I started tracking signal strength like a ghost hunter, watching which direction made the static louder. It peaked whenever the antenna array pointed toward the decommissioned lighthouse. We wrote it up as unidentified interference and got on with the shift. I told myself it was some creepy coincidence. That worked until the next week, when it came back stronger. Same static, same whisper, but this time there were numbers. Between the words, "turn around," a strained little voice started reciting coordinates. They were choppy at first, but after about 20 minutes of listening and scribbling, I realized they were repeating the exact same set over and over. When I plugged them into the chart, my stomach dropped. It was the location of the lighthouse, not just the island, the actual tower. My supervisor humored me and filed a tech request. They sent a guy out there in a small boat the next day to check the beacon. Nothing was wrong with the equipment, but when he came back, he tossed a damp, moldy-looking stuffed animal on the desk and asked if it belonged to anyone. He'd found it wedged at the base of the tower steps, a little blue whale. One of the eyes had rotted off. I knew that whale. It was the same model my sister had when we were kids. We grew up in this town. Our parents used to bring us to watch the lighthouse from the beach. One summer, we got too close to the rocks and a rogue wave nearly took her off her feet. She dropped her stuffed whale, trying to scramble back up. The current grabbed it, slammed it against the stones near the tower, and pulled it under. She screamed until she lost her voice that day. She died in a boating accident 2 years ago. Different part of the coast, different conditions, closed case. But I couldn't stop thinking about the way she'd sounded on the phone the last night I talked to her, saying the fog was weirdly loud, and she kept hearing a horn that wasn't on the charts. The static came back one more time before I quit. Same channel, same pulse. Only this time the whisper wasn't turn around. It said my name. Then, "You left me there." I slammed the volume down and sat there staring at the radio, heart pounding loud in my ears. The logbook in front of me blurred. When I looked up, the older duty officer was watching me with this unreadable expression. "You hearing it too?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer. He nodded toward the window, where you could see the faint outline of the lighthouse way out on the dark water. "Those kids that drowned off the point back in the 80s, he said. "Their ma used to come in here once a week and ask if there'd been any strange calls. Said she heard her boy on the VHF at night, whispering, asking her to turn around." I waited for him to laugh, to wave it off as some local ghost story. He didn't. "Static's been acting up a lot more since you signed on," he said instead. "Might be time to rotate you inland." I quit a month later. I still keep an old handheld radio in my apartment drawer. Sometimes, late at night, I think about switching it on and scanning until I hit that static again. I never do. But every once in a while, when the TV's off and the room's quiet, I swear I hear a tiny voice right behind the wall where my bed is, whispering coordinates, trying to get me to look back at something I can't see anymore. Title: The Guest Book on the Cliff. My girlfriend and I stayed in one of those unique Airbnb experiences for our anniversary, a renovated keeper's cottage right next to a lighthouse on a cliff. The listing photos made it look cozy and romantic. String lights, rustic furniture, ocean view. It was cheaper than I expected. In hindsight, that should have been a red flag. The first day was fine, windy, but fine. The second night, the power flickered a lot. The host had left a binder with history of the property stuff, clearly printed off some local website. There were old photos of the lighthouse, a short paragraph about a keeper who died suddenly, that kind of thing. What wasn't in the binder was the guest book. We found it in a locked drawer in the hallway dresser. The key was hanging on a nail right next to it, like they didn't really want you to find it, but didn't hide it well either. Inside was a thick, dusty notebook with guests stamped in gold on the front. The first pages were normal, messy notes from families in the 90s when the cottage was first turned into a rental. Little drawings from kids, complaints about the foghorn. Then, without any explanation, the handwriting changed. All of a sudden, the entries became sparse. No hearts, no doodles, just names, dates in and out, number of nights stayed, almost like a logbook. About halfway through, I realized something that made my mouth go dry. A lot of the checkout dates were months, sometimes years, in the future from when they were written. One entry was dated 10 years ago, but the departing date next to it was this year. "This is a joke, right?" my girlfriend said, frowning. "Like some weird artist thing." I flipped ahead toward the end. The pages got more smudged, like wet hands had passed over them. The last full page had 3 names listed in precise, identical handwriting. The departing dates were all today. 2 of them were names I didn't recognize. The third was mine. Same spelling, same middle initial. Under departing, instead of a normal date, someone had written just one word: pending. We both laughed it off because what else do you do? We made nervous jokes about cursed timeshares. I shut the book and relocked the drawer, trying to ignore the way the wind sounded exactly like a person moaning when it hit the side of the house. Around midnight, the power went out completely. No lights, no Wi-Fi, no phone signal. The only thing still working was a little emergency lamp in the hallway that glowed this weak yellow. The cottage suddenly felt older, like the decades we'd seen in the photos had snapped back into place. We heard footsteps upstairs, slow, deliberate, directly over our heads. No one else was booked on the property. The host had been very clear about that. "Old pipes," I whispered, even though pipes don't walk from one end of a room to the other and stop exactly above the top of the stairs. The emergency lamp dimmed every time the footsteps moved. At one point, something started tapping 3 times, always 3, on the wall next to the bedroom door. Not loud, just a patient, hollow knock, like someone was checking rooms. We didn't open the door. We lay there in the dark, holding our breath, listening to the slow tour of the house, ceiling creaking, steps descending halfway, stopping, retreating, over and over. Around 4 in the morning, just when I thought I might actually fall asleep from sheer exhaustion, the tapping stopped completely. The silence felt heavy, like the air had thickened. Then, from down the hallway, I heard the soft scrape of something wooden sliding open. The locked dresser drawer. I swear I could hear pages turning, slow and deliberate. Every flip coincided with a small change in the air, like a draft moving around our room. By sheer animal panic, I got up and cracked the bedroom door just enough to see the hallway. The emergency lamp was brighter than before. The drawer was open. The guest book lay on top of the dresser, open to the last page. I could see my name clearly, the letters darker now, like fresh ink had been dragged over them, and the word pending had been crossed out. In its place, in the same cramped handwriting, was a different word: delayed. We left at dawn. No shower, no breakfast, just threw our stuff in bags and got out. When the host messaged later asking why we'd checked out early, I lied and said the power issues freaked us out. 2 days after we got home, I went to leave a review. The listing was gone. When I clicked the old link, it redirected to a property unavailable page with a short note from Airbnb Legal. Something about ongoing investigation and guest safety. No details. Sometimes I think about that guest book, still open in that hallway, waiting for more names, and every time something almost kills me, a car running a red light, a ladder slipping, that moment of weightlessness where you think, this is it. I can't shake the feeling that somewhere on a cliff there's a hand hovering over my entry, pen ready, deciding whether to cross out delayed and write something final. Title: 3 Knocks from the Spiral Staircase. My high school took one of those cheesy, haunted lighthouse tours on a class trip. It was the middle of the day, bright sun, lots of tourists. The guide was this guy in his 30s who obviously loved his job a little too much. He told us all the usual stories: keepers going insane, ships wrecked because someone saw a light in the wrong place, weird sounds in fog. His favorite story, though, was about the staircase. Every night at closing, he said, patting the metal railing, the last guy down hears 3 knocks on one of the doors. Doesn't matter which landing. Just 3, always on the side you're standing on. Old keeper still doing his rounds. Everyone laughed. Someone behind me banged on the stairwell wall and made half the class jump. It stuck with me, though, in that way dumb throwaway lines sometimes do. I wouldn't have thought about it again if we hadn't gotten locked inside. A storm rolled in faster than expected while we were at the top. The staff rushed everyone down, but the wind was so bad they decided to shut the main building early. Somewhere in the chaos, our small group, me, my friend Dylan, and 2 other kids, got separated. By the time we realized everyone else was gone, we were standing in the lantern room with the door shut and the wind howling so loud you couldn't hear yourself talk. The heater cut off. The safety lights flickered out. The only illumination was the grey daylight through the glass and the occasional flash of lightning. We tried the door. It wouldn't budge. Probably stuck, Dylan said way too calmly. Let's wait it out. Someone will notice 4 kids missing. We sat on the floor, backs against the wall, trying not to freak out. The tower creaked with every gust of wind. At some point, the floor under us vibrated in this weird, rhythmic way. Not wind, not thunder, footsteps, far below, coming up. Staff? One of the other kids whispered. I wanted it to be staff, but it didn't sound like a normal walk. The steps were too slow, too evenly spaced, almost measured. They'd pause on each landing for a few seconds, then start up again. We held our breath as they got closer. At the landing right below ours, they stopped. Silence stretched out so long I started to think I'd imagined the whole thing. Then, knock, knock, knock. 3 heavy, deliberate knocks on the door to the lantern room. The one right in front of us. Dylan swallowed. Hello, we're stuck in here. No answer. The handle didn't move. The knocks didn't repeat. After a minute, we convinced ourselves it had just been the wind slamming something. We waited. No more footsteps, no voices from below. Eventually we heard faint shouting from outside, staff doing a head count most likely. They must have realized we were missing. It took them almost an hour to get the jammed door open. When it finally swung inward, 2 staff members were red-faced and sweating from the effort. They insisted nobody had come up since the evacuation. The main interior door at the base had been locked from the outside the entire time. We stumbled down to the lobby, shook, soaked from condensation. Our teacher freaked out and fussed over us. I tried to make a joke about the ghost tour being extra immersive. The guide didn't laugh. On the bus ride back, I couldn't stop replaying the sound in my head. Those 3 perfect knocks. The way they happened right after the footsteps paused below us, like whoever was climbing had stopped to check if the top was clear. Weeks later, I got my hands on one of those self-published pamphlets about the lighthouse history from a local shop. In the back was a short, badly written section about documented paranormal experiences. Most of it was recycled nonsense. One thing stuck out, though. It mentioned that the last full-time keeper had been found dead on the spiral staircase during a storm. Heart attack. What made it weird, according to the pamphlet, was his position. He hadn't fallen. He was kneeling upright in front of the door to the lantern room, one hand pressed flat against it like he'd been knocking. The log entry from the relief crew, quoted in shaky handwriting, said this: Found Harris at top landing, 3 bruises on right-hand knuckles. Door locked from inside, no one else present. Now, whenever I hear someone knock 3 times on anything, door, table, wall, my chest tightens for a second. It sounds too much like a question. Are you in there? And I still don't know what would have happened if we'd decided to open that door first. 6. Title: The Extra Window in the Storm. My family rented a little cottage on the coast one fall. From the living room window, you could see the old lighthouse way out on the rocks. It wasn't operational anymore, just a tourist attraction, but it looked nice at sunset. I took a ton of photos that first evening, trying to get the perfect moody ocean shot. Later that night, a storm rolled in off the water. Heavy rain, hard wind, the whole cliché. The power flickered but didn't go out, so I got bored and started flipping through the pictures on my camera. That's when I saw it. In one of the photos, taken right before dark, the lighthouse looked normal at first glance. Then I noticed an extra window near the top. It was small and round, glowing faintly orange, with a clear silhouette standing in it. The outline was unsettlingly sharp, head tilted slightly to one side, shoulders stiff, hands braced against the glass like whoever it was leaning forward to look straight at the camera. I went to the actual living room window and checked the lighthouse itself. There were only 3 visible windows. No small round one. Definitely nothing lit. Just darkness and rain. I told myself it was a reflection or a lens glitch, closed the curtains and tried not to think about it. Around 2 in the morning, the wind woke me up. It was so strong the whole cottage seemed to flex. I got up to check the front door, make sure it was latched, and something made me peek out between the living room curtains. The lighthouse was barely visible through the sheets of rain, just a darker shape against the sky. But up near the top, I could see it. A tiny, warm circle of light where no window should be. And that same silhouette, thinner now maybe, but still pressed up against the glass, watching the cottage. I stood there, frozen, until lightning flashed and lit up the scene like a photograph. In that split second of stark white, the window and the figure vanished. When my vision adjusted, the top of the lighthouse was just a black outline again. The next day, I walked down to the cove and followed the path around to see the lighthouse up close. The tour season was over. The gate was chained, but I could see most of the tower from the rocks. 3 cracked windows, no round one near the top. No signs of any recent work. As I turned to go, something glinted on the ground near the base. I picked it up. It was a shard of very old glass, curved slightly, with a faint metal rim. The edge was smooth, like it had been part of something round. When I held it up to the light, it warped the world into a tight circle. For just a second, as the glass caught the sun, I thought I saw a human face reflected in it, eyes too close, mouth too wide. I dropped it and walked back faster than I meant to. That night the storm came back harder. This time, the power went out. The house was completely black, except for a dim glow edging the curtains. I thought it was lightning at first, but the light stayed steady. I went to the window and pulled the curtain back an inch. There was a window looking back at me, not in the lighthouse, in the glass of our own cottage window. A perfect little circle of warm light, hovering like a portal, with the same silhouette standing in it on the other side. Closer now, almost close enough to see features. The outline of hands pressed against the glass. I didn't sleep the rest of the trip. We left a day early. A few weeks later, back home, curiosity got the better of me, and I zoomed in on that original photo as far as the pixels would allow. The silhouette in the extra lighthouse window was blurred, but you could still make out some details. The head was tilted like I remembered. The arms were raised, hands flat on the glass, and the face, in all that grainy grey, looked exactly like mine. 7. Title: The Beacon That Followed Our Boat. I grew up on the water. My dad was a fisherman, his dad was a fisherman, and everybody in town knew how to drive a boat before they knew how to drive a car. The old lighthouse was just part of the scenery, a dead tower on a rock, something tourists took pictures of. We joked that it was off-duty now that GPS existed. One summer night, my dad let me and my younger brother take the small boat out by ourselves for the first time. We stayed close to shore, just far enough to feel on our own, but not enough to worry him. The sky was clear when we left. By the time we'd been out there an hour, a low fog started rolling in. "Let's head back," I said. My brother pouted but didn't argue. I turned the bow toward the harbor. That's when the light came on. It hit the water like a knife, this bright white beam swinging calmly across the fog, starting from the direction of the old lighthouse. We both froze. The lantern hadn't worked since my dad was a kid. We'd climbed up there once on a dare and seen nothing but rust and dust. But there it was, plain as day. A rotating beam, sweeping over the ocean in a perfect mechanical rhythm. "Maybe they're testing something," my brother said. "Maybe," I lied. I opened up the throttle a bit, wanting to get back inside the harbor markers. As the boat picked up speed, I noticed something that twisted my stomach into a knot. The beam wasn't doing a full rotation anymore. It was tracking us. Wherever the boat went, the beam followed like a spotlight. If I turned 15 degrees to the left, it swung left. If I cut right, it cut right with us. The fog lit up around the boat in a tight, glowing corridor. Everything outside that cone of light was just black. "What is it aiming at?" my brother whispered. I didn't want to say it out loud, but I could see it clearly. The light wasn't centered on the boat. It was centered on him. No matter where he sat, bow, stern, port, starboard, the brightest part of the beam slid to keep him dead in the center. When I stepped between him and the light, the brightness shifted slightly to catch his shoulder. I grabbed the radio to call my dad or the harbor master. All I got was static and this low, almost mechanical murmur, like someone talking underwater. I killed the engine, heart pounding, and for a second, we just drifted in silence under that white glare. "Stand up," I told my brother. He did. The light followed his head. "Sit." It followed him down. He laughed, trying to pretend it was cool, but his eyes were wide. "Maybe it's a sensor, like motion tracking, from a busted lantern room on a decommissioned tower," I said. He didn't have an answer for that. I don't remember making the decision to gun it. 1 second we were floating. The next the engine was roaring and the boat was cutting a straight line for shore. The beam kept pace the whole way, never wobbling, never losing him in its center. The fog got thicker, beads of water stinging our faces, but the path ahead stayed lit, like we were being guided in. The second we crossed the invisible line of the harbor entrance, where the old markers used to stand before they fell apart, the beam snapped off, not faded out, just went black. The fog swallowed everything. We almost hit another boat in the murk. My dad chewed us out for being reckless, but when we tried to tell him about the light, he went quiet. Then he said something that didn't help. "We used to say the lighthouse only woke up to guide the ones it wanted," he muttered, "usually right before a bad storm." A year later, my brother died in rough water. Freak accident, they said. Sudden squall. Boat flipped. No time to call for help. His body washed up not far from where that beam had first locked onto him. I moved inland after that. Haven't been on a boat in years. Last Christmas I went home to visit my parents. One night my dad and I sat in the truck near the beach, not talking much. The old lighthouse was a dark tooth on the horizon. I got a call on the marine radio a few months after he passed. My dad said suddenly, "Middle of the night, weak signal, little voice, sounded a lot like your brother, kept saying he was under the light and to tell you he was okay. Then it cut out." He laughed sadly. "Probably some kid messing around with equipment." I looked out at the black line of the sea and the dead tower beyond it and didn't say anything, because every once in a while when I wake up for no reason in the middle of the night in my landlocked apartment, I swear I can see a thin slice of white moving slowly across my ceiling, like a beam turning, looking for someone it already marked a long time ago. 8. Title: The Child in the Keeper's Journal. I'll keep this one tight since you've already seen the style from story number 8. This is a different narrator, different lighthouse. I was cataloguing old books for a small-town historical society when I stumbled on the keeper's journals. Most of them were boring. Weather notes, supply lists, complaints about birds. One notebook was different. The handwriting was frantic, and the entries focused on what the keeper called the boy who lives in the light. At first I thought he meant a ghost kid people saw in the lantern room. He described a small face pressed against the glass at night, cheeks flattened, eyes too wide. He sketched it several times in the margins, crude little charcoal drawings that still somehow managed to feel wrong. The proportions were off in a way that made my skin crawl. Eyes set a fraction too close, mouth a little too low. The more I read, the more detailed the sketches became. In one entry he wrote, "He gets clearer every year, he looks older, or I do, maybe both." That made no sense. Then I hit an entry near the end where the ink was darker than anything else in the book. Tonight I saw the boy in the reflection instead of the glass. He was behind me, not outside, standing in the room, but only in the mirror. I recognized him this time. Took me a while. He's the one from the photograph, the one they dropped off here when I started. They said he'd drowned. He looks like me, only smaller. I've been watching myself die for years and didn't realize. I didn't understand what he meant until I turned the page and saw the last drawing. It was more detailed than the others, like he'd really taken his time. A child's face, maybe 10 years old, with a bowl-cut haircut and a small scar on the right eyebrow. I have that scar. Got it when I was a kid, hit my head on a coffee table. My mom has pictures of me with that exact haircut, that exact look. The more I stared at the drawing, the more my brain tried to tell me it wasn't a coincidence. The kid in the journal looked exactly like I did in second grade. I laughed it off in the building, filed the journal away, and tried not to think about it. That night, alone in my apartment, I caught my reflection in the turned-off TV and froze. For a fraction of a second, my reflection wasn't synced. I moved my head. It was a heartbeat behind. My own face, staring back at me, eyes a little too wide. And for just that moment I could see a smaller face behind mine, like a kid standing inside the glass, pressing up against the back of my reflection. He had my haircut, my scar, my expression from those old family photos. The TV screen flickered, and the image snapped back to normal. But when I looked closer, there were faint, greasy marks on the inside of the glass, smudges in the exact shape of two small hands. I quit the Historical Society a week later. Someone else can finish reading what the keeper wrote about the boy who kept getting older in the reflections. 9. Title: The Keeper in the Mirror Glass. I got contracted to help restore a lighthouse lens, one of those big Fresnel setups with 100 curved panels. The thing had been sitting neglected for years, layered in salt and grime. My job was simple: clean, document, don't break anything. I worked alone most days because the foundation didn't have the budget for a full crew. From the first week, the reflections bothered me. The lens is basically a 360-degree funhouse mirror. Every time you move, you see yourself chopped up and repeated, distorted in a dozen different angles. I'd been in enough museums not to care usually, but this felt different. I'd catch a glimpse of someone behind me and turn around only to find empty air. One afternoon, I noticed something off in one of the panels. In every other slice of glass, my reflection looked the same: jeans, work shirt, baseball cap. In this particular panel, there was someone else standing just to my left. He was older, in an oilskin coat, with a cap I recognized from old photographs. His beard was patchy and grey. He wasn't looking at my reflection. He was looking straight out of the glass, like he could see me on the other side. When I turned, no one was there. When I faced the lens again, he was gone from that panel. I told myself it was a weird distortion from one of the old tourist photos taped up somewhere behind the glass, except there were no photos, just me, the empty lantern room, and the sea. The next time I saw him, it was raining. The room felt colder than usual. I was wiping down the inner rings when I caught a full-on reflection of him in the glass directly in front of me. No distortion. He was standing where I was, overlapping me in the image, like we were sharing the same space at different times. He moved when I did, but not in sync. If I lifted my arm, his lifted a second later. If I turned my head, he followed with this delayed, jerky motion, like an old video buffering. I backed away so fast I nearly slipped. The reflection didn't vanish. He just kept staring for a long moment, and then he raised his hand to the glass. The exact panel in front of me fogged on the inside, like someone had breathed on it. I left early that day. When I mentioned it to the oldest guy on the foundations board, expecting him to make fun of me, he just sighed. Keeper used to talk to himself in that lens, he said he could see who was coming to relieve him before the boat was even in sight. Said time ran funny in there. We figured it was the isolation getting to him. I almost quit. Then on my last week, I made the mistake of staying after dark to finish a section. The lantern room lights were off. My only illumination was a work lamp plugged into an extension cord. Beyond the glass, the sea was just a void. The lens reflected my lamp 100 times, throwing weird shapes on the walls. I was packing up when I saw him again. Not in a single panel this time, everywhere, in every facet of the lens, superimposed over my positions. Two figures moving almost together, one fractionally delayed. Me in the present, him in whatever time he belonged to. He lifted his hand again. So did I, because it felt wrong not to. Our fingers met on the glass in a dozen ghostly overlays. In the reflection, he mouthed something. I couldn't hear it, but I could see the shape of the word. Stay. Behind him, through the glass, the sea looked wrong. Too bright, lit by a rotating beam I knew wasn't on. For a brief, insane second, I had this urge to just step forward, into the reflection, into that other version of the lantern room where the lens was new and the keeper wasn't alone. The work lamp flickered, the extension cord buzzed, the images shattered into random fragments, just my own scared face staring back at me. When I looked down, there was a faint smear on the glass where his hand had been. Old oil, maybe, or something else. I finished the contract, but I never went back up there alone. The lens is on display now. People walk around it and point at their funny, warped reflections and take selfies with the ocean behind them. Sometimes I wonder what happens if you catch the light just right, if one of those reflections looks a half-second behind the others, and if the man staring out from that delay is still waiting for someone to take his place so he can finally leave. 10. Title: The Stare That Wasn't There. Yesterday I worked as a part-time caretaker for a lighthouse that had been turned into a museum. My job was mostly cleaning, locking up, and making sure drunk tourists didn't fall down the stairs. I knew that tower better than my own apartment. Every chip in the paint, every loose step, every creak in the railing. That's why I noticed the extra stair. One Monday morning before opening, I was doing my usual climb to check the lantern room. The spiral staircase had exactly 147 steps. I knew this because one of the guides made kids guess the number on tours, and I'd had to count it once to confirm. That morning, when I hit what I thought was step 147, my foot came down on more. A new step. It looked the same as the others. Same metal, same wear, but the spacing was off just enough that my body noticed. I stopped, dizzy, and looked up. I was standing on a small flat patch that hadn't existed before, a tiny landing between the final curve and the lantern room door. The wall next to it felt wrong. The bricks had a faint rectangular outline, like there had once been a small door there that had been sealed over. The air around that spot was colder, enough that I could see my breath in one quick puff, even though the rest of the tower was just chilly. I backed down, counting the steps out loud. 146, 147, 148. I figured I'd miscounted the first time. Maybe the landing had always been there and I'd never noticed. People miss things all the time. I told myself that for 3 days. On Thursday, I asked one of the older guides, a guy who'd been doing tours since before I was born, how many steps there were. 147, he said without hesitating. We counted them together that afternoon after closing. He stopped at the old number, baffled, when we hit the new little landing. Huh, he said. Must have always been here. His voice didn't sound convinced. That night I dreamed about the lighthouse. In the dream, I was climbing the stairs in the dark. My flashlight only lit up a few steps at a time. When I reached the new landing, there was a door in the wall where the blank bricks had been. It was narrow, made of some dark wood, with a simple metal knob. Someone was knocking softly from the other side. Not 3 times, not any pattern. Just a slow, desperate tap-tap-tap like fingernails. I woke up with my heart racing and the taste of dust in my mouth. The next week, weird little things started happening around the tower. The temperature on that landing stayed several degrees colder than everywhere else, even on warm days. Visitors would pause there and shiver, rubbing their arms, looking confused, like they'd walked through an invisible curtain. A kid on a school trip burst into tears halfway up and refused to go past the new step. When the teacher asked why, the kid just kept sobbing. "The man's in the wall. He said he's sorry. He said don't open it." We hadn't told anyone about the dream door. I tried not to let it get under my skin. Then one evening, during a bad storm, I had to stay late to secure some exhibits. The building emptied out fast. I was alone with the sound of rain lashing the windows and the low groan of wind. The power flickered once and held. I don't know why I went up the staircase. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it was all in my head. Maybe something wanted me there. When I reached the landing, the air was ice. My breath came out in visible clouds. Every hair on my arm stood up. There was no door, just the same faint outline in the bricks. But from inside that outline came a sound I will never forget. A long, slow exhale, like someone who'd been holding their breath in a tiny space for a very long time, finally letting it out. It vibrated through the stone, into my hand where it rested on the wall, into my bones. Then a whisper, muffled but unmistakable. "One more step." I ran, nearly broke my neck on the way down. I locked up without doing the full checklist and called in sick for 3 days. When I came back, the landing was gone. The staircase was back to its original count, 147 steps, no more, no less. The cold patch was gone. The wall was just wall. I mentioned it to the old guide once in a roundabout way. He got this faraway look and said, "We had a keeper die here, you know, between floors. They said he froze to death in a space that wasn't there when they drew the blueprints. Closet or something. Can't find the records anymore." He shrugged it off like a weird rumor. I let him. Now I count steps everywhere. On buses, in apartment buildings, climbing out of subway stations, and every time the number feels off by 1, I get that same tight feeling in my chest, like there's a door waiting just out of sight, trying to decide whether it's ready to appear again. 11. Title: The Lighthouse That Moved Closer. When I was a kid, my grandparents had a little vacation house on a cliff. You could see the lighthouse from the living room window, way out on its own rock, tiny and harmless. At night, when it was still working, the beam would sweep over the sea without ever touching the house. It was like a moving star we could watch from a safe distance. Years later, after the lighthouse was decommissioned, my husband and I went back to that house for a weekend. The tower was darker now, just a grey shape on the horizon. No beam, no sound, just a landmark. The first night I woke up around 3 for no reason and glanced out the bedroom window. The lighthouse looked bigger, closer to the shore than I remembered. I told myself my sense of scale was off. Memories are unreliable. The second night, I noticed it again. From the living room where we sat playing cards, the lighthouse filled more of the window than it had earlier. The base seemed almost in line with a jagged outcropping I knew used to be a good distance away. "Did they rebuild part of it?" my husband asked when I brought it up. "Like add a foundation?" We joked about global warming and rising sea levels, but the rock it stood on looked the same. It was the tower that seemed to be migrating. By the 3rd day, I was uneasy. I dug through an old box of my grandparents' photos in the attic and found several taken from that same window. In all of them, the lighthouse was a small, thin thing on the horizon, separated from the house by a wide stretch of visible water. I went downstairs and took a photo from the same angle. In the new picture, the lighthouse was huge. It dominated the frame, the base almost level, with the edge of the cliff where our backyard ended. The strip of water between looked disturbingly narrow. "When did they move it?" I said out loud, half joking. "You can't move a lighthouse," my husband replied. "That's the whole point. It's supposed to stay put." That night the wind picked up. The house creaked in ways it hadn't before. Around midnight, something woke me, a low, steady hum, like distant machinery. I went to the living room and pulled the curtains aside. The lighthouse was no longer on its rock. It was standing in our backyard. Not fully. Its base seemed buried in the cliff somehow, the stones and grass blending into its foundation like a bad Photoshop job. The tower loomed over the house, close enough that if I stepped outside, I felt like I could touch it. The windows were dark. The door at the bottom faced directly toward our back porch. I should have woken my husband. Instead, I stood there, heart pounding, watching in numb disbelief as a faint, sickly light flickered in the lantern room. No beam swept the ocean. The light stayed fixed, pointing down at the house. Somewhere deep in the structure, I heard grinding, metal on metal, gears waking up after years of disuse. The hum I'd heard in my sleep grew louder. The glass in the lantern room glowed brighter. Then from behind me, inside the house, floorboards creaked. Slow, heavy footsteps crossed the hallway toward the back door. Not ours. We were both in the living room. The sound came from empty rooms, from weight that shouldn't exist. The back doorknob turned slowly, once, twice, testing. We'd locked it before bed. I watched it rattle gently, then go still. Outside, the tower door opened on its own, just a dark, vertical line at first, then a wider blackness. Something about that empty doorway was worse than any shadow person or ghost cliché I'd ever imagined. It felt like the world had been cut open in the wrong place. The urge to step outside was overwhelming. My hand moved toward the sliding glass door without my permission. My feet shifted, ready to cross that thin line between house and yard. My husband grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "Don't," he said, voice shaking. "You're sleepwalking." "I'm awake," I whispered. "Still don't," he said. We stayed like that, glued to the spot, until the light in the lantern room flickered and went out. The humming stopped. The grinding faded. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the tower seemed to shrink. The next time I blinked, it was back on its distant rock, just a grey spike in the dark, separated from us by water and common sense. In the morning, the backyard looked normal. No crushed grass, no weird indentations. The only sign anything had happened was a faint circular shadow on the lawn, where the base of the lighthouse would have stood if it had really been there, like the after-image you get when you stare at something too bright for too long. We left that day, sold the house a year later. I don't know who owns it now. Sometimes, though, when I wake up in my city apartment and look out at the neighboring buildings, I get a weird feeling. Like if I glance away and look back fast enough, one of them will be closer than it was before. And somewhere, out on some coast where no one is watching, I can't shake the idea that a dead lighthouse is trying different houses, 1 yard at a time, seeing which door will finally open. 12. Title: The Photos That Aged Overnight. My friend Mia and I did a road trip one summer, hitting a bunch of random tourist spots. One of them was a ruined lighthouse on a rocky coast. It was fenced off, but people had cut a hole, so of course we climbed through to get better photos. We spent maybe half an hour there, taking overly dramatic shots, me pretending to fall off the rocks, her doing fashion poses against the tower. The sky was bright blue. The grass around the base was green and overgrown. It was stupid and harmless. That night, in the cheap motel we were sharing, we started going through the day's pictures on my camera. The first few looked exactly like I remembered. Then we got to the lighthouse set. In the first image, something was off. The sky was a darker grey than it had been. The clouds looked thicker. In the second, the grass around the base was sparse and brown instead of lush. By the third, there were puddles of water reflecting a sky so dark it could have been evening, even though we'd been there at noon. "Did your camera auto-adjust or something?" Mia asked. I flipped to the last picture of her standing with her back to the tower, arms out, laughing. In that one, the lighthouse looked worse. The stones were cracked deeper. There was black moss or mold streaking the walls. The sky behind her was almost black, no visible sun. Mia, though, was the worst part. She looked older. Not dramatically, but enough that my brain registered it. Tiny lines at the corners of her mouth that hadn't been there hours before. Dark circles under her eyes. In the zoomed-in pixels, I could see a few strands of grey in her hair. We checked the timestamp. Taken at 12:14 p.m., same minute as the others. "These are edited," she said, trying to laugh. "You did some filter thing." "I didn't," I said. "I haven't even imported them yet." We went back out the next morning to prove to ourselves it was a glitch. The weather was worse, overcast, windy, but the lighthouse itself looked like it had in the last photo. Cracks, mold, dead grass. It was like the building in the images had become the building in real life overnight. Mia didn't want to go through the fence again. I didn't blame her. On the way back to the car, she stopped and grabbed my arm. "Did you post anything?" she asked. I hadn't, but she had. One quick Instagram story the afternoon before. We pulled it up. In the tiny video, the lighthouse behind her still looked almost new. Blue sky, green grass. Temporary, disappearing in 24 hours. "Maybe it's just your camera," she said. We decided to drop it, pretend it was a weird tech issue. Vacation logic. 2 weeks later, back home, I was scrolling through my phone late at night when a set of new photos popped up in my shared album. They were time-stamped that day, but I hadn't taken any. There were 3 images, all of the lighthouse, each from slightly farther away, like someone was backing off slowly. The sky was pitch black. Waves crashed over rocks that had been dry when we were there. The tower leaned at a sick angle, stones missing, windows dark. In the last image, taken from what looked like the road above the coast, the lighthouse was gone, just churning water where it had been. I texted Mia immediately. "Me, did you send those lighthouse pics?" "Mia, what pics?" "Me, the ones you just added to the album." "Mia, I'm at work. I haven't opened photos all day." I screenshotted and sent them. 3 dots appeared. Then nothing for a long time. Finally, "Mia, that's messed up. I had a dream about that place last night. Waves hitting it. It fell. I woke up coughing like I'd swallowed water. A month after that, I got a call at 2 in the morning. It was her boyfriend, voice shaking. There'd been an accident, sudden flooding at a campsite by a river. No warning. I drove 6 hours to the hospital. She was alive but exhausted, hooked up to an IV, fingers raw from grabbing rocks. "They said it was a freak surge," she rasped, "like the river rose all at once." She laughed without humor. "I knew how to swim, but it didn't feel like I was in that river." "Where did it feel like?" I asked. She closed her eyes. "Like I was under that lighthouse. I don't take many pictures anymore. When I do, I back them up immediately, then delete them from my devices. I don't like the idea of images hanging around where something else could get to them. Every few months, though, a random beach photo will pop up in my shared album, time-stamped at times I know I was at home. The water is always higher in those shots than it should be. The sky is darker. The buildings in the distance look older. And in the top corner of one from last week, barely visible unless you zoom way in, there's a pale, familiar shape on the horizon. A lighthouse on a rock that hasn't existed for years. Title: The Call from Inside the Fog. I used to work on a small tour boat that did evening runs along the coast. We'd circle near an old decommissioned lighthouse, tell the usual ghost stories, then head back before the fog got too heavy. Most nights, the creepiest thing that happened was people dropping their phones overboard while filming. The weird night started quiet. Clear skies, calm water, almost boring. About halfway through the route, a low fog started sliding in from the open sea. Not unusual, but it thickened fast, turning the air into a wall of white. The lighthouse on the cliff went from sharp silhouette to vague shadow in minutes. The captain flipped on the radar and slowed down. "We'll be fine," he said over the PA. "Just a little extra atmosphere for your spooky tour." I was inside the tiny cabin watching the screens when the VHF radio crackled to life. A woman's voice cut through the static, tense, breathless. "Hello? Is anyone reading this? We're lost in the fog. We can't see anything, we're just under the light." I glanced at the captain. He frowned and grabbed the mic. "This is the tour vessel Marigold. What's your position?" Silence. Then the same woman, closer, almost like she was standing right next to the radio. "We're under the light," she repeated. "We can see you. Why can't you see us?" I checked the radar. Nothing but us. No other boats, no rogue echoes. Just our little green blob. "Say again. What's your vessel name?" the captain asked. There was a long pause. In the background I could hear water slapping hard against something and a sound like metal scraping rock. We don't have a name anymore," she said finally. "It's gone. Everything's gone. The fog won't let us off the water. Please, you're right there." I stepped outside the cabin and squinted into the fog. I could barely see the bow, let alone another boat. The lighthouse was gone completely, swallowed. But under the edges of the tourists' nervous chatter, I swear I could hear someone else yelling, distant, muffled, pleading. "Blow the horn," the captain told me quietly. I hit the air horn. The sound blasted out and bounced back at us in a weird, delayed echo. A second later, the radio screamed with feedback so loud, I ripped the headphones off. Under the shriek, the woman's voice was still going, now panicked. No, that's not right. That's not us. That's..." Crash. Then static. The tourists thought it was part of the show. I heard nervous laughter below deck, people clapping. The captain's knuckles were white on the wheel. "Harbour, this is Marigold. Did you copy that last transmission?" he said into another channel. Harbour control came back bored and clear. "Negative, Marigold. We've got nothing on our end. All quiet on the board." I looked at the radio log. The call had come in on channel 16, clear as day. But the little RX indicator light, the one that glows when a signal is received, had never lit. It was like we'd heard something that hadn't actually passed through the normal circuitry. The fog thinned just as suddenly as it had rolled in. The lighthouse reappeared like a shadow getting filled in. The passengers cheered. The captain forced a joke about our friends in the mist. We finished the tour and went back to dock. Later that night, after everyone else left, I stayed behind to close up and found myself staring at the radio. On impulse, I flipped to channel 16 and pressed the mic button without saying anything. The moment I let it go, the speaker hissed. "You're still there," the same woman whispered, as if the sentence had been waiting. "You came back. We're still under the light. It won't change. The fog won't ever change." Every hair on my arms lifted. "Where are you?" I asked. Something slammed against metal on her end. It sounded like a body hitting a hull. "In between," she said. "They turned the light the wrong way. We missed the rocks and missed the shore and never stopped missing. We see you all the time. Different boats, different faces, same stupid stories." I couldn't breathe. "What do you want?" Her answer was simple, and it came in a voice that suddenly sounded less like one woman and more like a crowd all speaking at once. "Turn it off." The lighthouse's beam flashed through the cabin window at that exact second, even though I knew it had been decommissioned for years. Just one bright sweep over the glass, then darkness. In that flash, in the reflection, I saw a cluster of faces behind me, dripping, pale, eyes open too wide. When I spun around, the cabin was empty. The next season, they updated the tour script and cut most of the fog ghost stories. People said it was to make it more family-friendly. I quit around the same time. I still live in the same town, though. On heavy fog nights, if I drive past the harbour and tune to 16, I sometimes catch a hiss of static and one word cutting through, "still." Like they're still circling under a light that isn't there anymore, wondering why no one can see them. Title: The New Lock on the Old Door. I like old buildings, so when the town opened up the lighthouse grounds for renovation volunteers, I signed up purely for the architecture. The tower door at the base was a beast. Heavy wood, original iron hinges, big corroded padlock that looked older than my grandmother. We worked there all week. No one had a key to that padlock. The plan was to remove it with a grinder once we'd cleared the surrounding rubble. Every morning, the same rusted lock hung there. Every evening, we chained a modern one through the outer gate and went home. On Thursday, I showed up early and walked the path alone. The gate chain was still in place, exactly as we'd left it, but when I reached the tower door, my stomach dropped. The old, corroded padlock was gone. In its place was a brand-new brass lock, still dull from the salt air, but obviously newer than the door, and definitely not ours. It had a ship's name stamped into the metal in tiny letters. I recognized it immediately. The same name as a ferry that had sunk off our coast decades ago, the story every local kid grew up hearing. I thought maybe one of the supervisors had gotten enthusiastic and started early, but when they arrived, they swore no one had touched the door. We didn't have permission yet. Insurance, they said. I leaned closer. The keyhole was crusted with dried salt and something dark, like old oil or blood. Around where the old lock had been, the wood was clean. Too clean. Almost polished. "Storm must have knocked the old one off," one of the guys said. "Some local freaks probably hung that as a prank." We laughed, because what else do you do? Somebody went for bolt cutters. When they snapped the lock, it didn't break like new metal. It crumbled. The shackle fell apart in flakes of rust, even though it had looked solid seconds before. The tag with the ship's name dropped into the dirt. When I picked it up, the letters were almost illegible, like they'd been underwater for years. The door itself groaned open a few inches and stopped. The air that rushed out from the gap was cold, damp, and carried a smell like old rope and rotting wood. I stuck my phone flashlight into the crack and saw just enough to make me step back. Scratch marks on the inside of the door, running from the center down to the floor, deep grooves like fingernails. We decided to leave the full opening for the official survey crew. Liability and all that. The door was pulled shut and wedged closed with new boards. That night, I couldn't shake the image of the fresh lock. I went down an internet rabbit hole looking up that ferry's sinking. Buried in a scanned newspaper article was a detail I'd never heard. The ferry had been temporarily rerouted that night because of a light anomaly near the lighthouse. The keeper at the time had insisted he'd never moved the beam. The captain swore he'd seen it swing inland, then vanish. They argued about it for weeks before the inquiry closed. The next morning, I shot straight to the lighthouse before work started, heart already thudding like it knew something I didn't. The new boards were on the ground, the door was ajar, and hanging there again, through the hasp, was the same brass lock with the ship's name, whole, untouched, like we'd never broken it. "You're messing with me, right?" I asked the nearest co-worker when he caught up. The genuine confusion on his face made my skin crawl. We broke it again. Same crumble, same puff of metallic dust. This time, we dragged the door fully open and wedged it with a rock just to prove we'd changed something. The tower's interior was just a hollow shaft of darkness and iron stairs. The cold felt heavier inside. We took a few pictures and backed out. The supervisor said we'd wait for the city inspector before going farther. That evening, every photo we'd taken of the open door showed it firmly closed. In some shots, the new lock was visible, unbroken, hanging neat and heavy. My last day on the site, I walked the path one more time, just to convince myself I'd imagined half of it. The gate's modern chain was still there. The tower door stood shut. There was no lock at all, just a naked hasp, slightly bent, and a faint outline in the wood where something heavy had hung for a long time. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt watched. Later at home, I emptied my hoodie pocket, and something cold and small slid into my palm. It was the brass tag with the ferry's name from the lock we'd broken. I hadn't put it there. I hadn't even realized I'd picked it up again. On the back, scratched so faintly I almost missed it, were 4 words. "Door never meant for land." I quit volunteering after that. The tower door is fully restored now. They do tours in the summer, little kids thundering up the stairs. The lock is gone. Nothing visibly holds that door closed, but every time I pass the cliff and see it from a distance, I get a weird feeling that something else is keeping it shut from the inside, at least for now. 25. Title: The Storm That Never Reached Shore. I used to work nights at a tiny coastal motel with a perfect view of the bay. On clear evenings, you could see the old lighthouse out on its rock. Not operational, just a dark spike against the horizon. One shift, I stepped out to smoke and saw lightning way out at sea. No thunder, just silent flashes, like paparazzi for some distant storm. The lighthouse silhouette stood sharp against it. Great, I thought. Power's going to go out again. But the wind by the motel was mild. The air didn't smell like rain. The water near shore was calm. As I watched, the storm over the ocean intensified. Forked lightning lanced down around the lighthouse, illuminating wild, thrashing waves and what looked like the outlines of ships in trouble. I squinted, trying to see better, but the shoreline stayed dry. No wind, no distant rumble. It was like watching a disaster movie on mute. I went back in, checked the radar on the weather site. It showed clear skies for 50 miles, no storm cells, nothing. Every time I stepped outside that night, the sky over the lighthouse was a mess. Black clouds, violent flashes, angry water. Meanwhile, the motel's flag barely stirred. Around 2 in the morning, curiosity won. I dug an old pair of binoculars out of the lost and found and pointed them at the lighthouse during one of the brighter lightning volleys. For a few frames, I saw everything too clearly. The waves around the rock were impossibly high, smashing against the tower with enough force to snap it in half. Ships, plural, listed dangerously close, their decks at insane angles. Tiny figures clung to rails and lines, some already in the water. Then the beam came on. The lighthouse, supposedly dead for decades, lit up with a harsh white glow. Instead of sweeping slowly, the beam jittered, snapping between ships in a frantic pattern. Every time it landed on one, the entire vessel seemed to shudder and lurch, like the light itself was a physical shove. I lowered the binoculars, heart pounding. To the naked eye, there was nothing but far-off flashes, no visible beam, no obvious chaos. On radar, still nothing. The storm raged like that until just before dawn. Then, as the sky lightened, it faded in a few minutes, leaving the horizon empty and calm. The lighthouse was just a dark tooth again. I told myself I'd had some kind of visual migraine. That evening, I asked one of the old regulars, a retired fisherman who practically lived at the motel, if he'd ever seen a storm way out there that never comes in. He went quiet. "Sometimes you see the old ones," he said finally. "Weather stuck on repeat where bad things happened. My dad used to say if the storm doesn't touch the shore, you don't look at it. That's not for us." A few days later, a local history nerd checked in. We got to talking, and I mentioned my weird non-storm. He pulled up a digitized newspaper archive and flipped to an article from the 1950s. There'd been a mass wreck just off the point. 3 ships driven into the rocks by a freak storm. Eyewitnesses on shore had reported seeing the lighthouse beam acting erratically, like it couldn't decide where to point. Over 100 people died. "They say the keeper went mad after," the guest said. "Swore he could still see the storm some nights, out of sync with the real weather. Town wrote it off as survivor's guilt." I laughed it off with him, but that night I didn't go outside at all. I peeked through the office window instead. The horizon over the lighthouse was quiet. No lightning, no clouds, just a scattering of indifferent stars. I relaxed. Then my phone buzzed with a notification from a weather app. Severe marine warning for our area. High winds, dangerous waves off the point. But outside, nothing. Trees barely moving, flags hanging limp. I checked the radar again. This time there was a weird smear of color right over where the lighthouse would be, a glitchy blob that flickered in and out each time the map refreshed. In the glass of the office window, reflected faintly, I saw a flash of lightning where the real sky behind me was clear, like the storm was happening in the reflection instead of the world. I quit that job at the end of the season. Moving inland felt safer. Now, when I see footage of freak storms or rogue waves online, I check the horizon in the background, just in case there's a tiny black tooth of a lighthouse there. And if the clouds in the video don't match the weather report for that day, I scroll past fast. Because whatever that storm is out there, it clearly doesn't care what year it is or who's watching from the shore. 26. Title: The Beam That Passed Through Walls. I rented a room in a converted keeper's house right next to a dead lighthouse. It was cheap because tourists preferred ocean views, not aging buildings that creaked in the wind. My room didn't face the water. Its only window looked inland, toward the road. The first time I saw the beam, I thought a car had pulled up outside. A narrow band of bright white light slid silently across my ceiling, then down the wall, then along the floor, perfectly straight. No sound of an engine, no passing headlights in the actual window, just that single focused strip cutting through the room. I froze on the bed, watching it move. It didn't fade as it crossed corners or furniture. It just passed through, like everything it touched was semi-transparent. The side of my dresser glowed where the beam intersected it, but there were no shadows thrown on the other side. It took about 10 seconds to cross the room and vanish through the opposite wall. My heart hammered. I looked out the window. Empty road, no cars, no people. The lighthouse on the cliff to my left was dark. No functioning lantern. Whoever owned it now used it as a venue sometimes, but there were no events that night. Searchlight? I muttered to myself. Some idiot with a drone? I wanted it to be anything but what it looked like. A lighthouse beam cutting straight through solid structures like they were nothing. It came back the next night, same time, same angle. This time I paid closer attention. There was a physical sensation when it touched me. As that narrow light crossed my chest, a crushing pressure clamped down. Not enough to knock me out, but enough that breathing felt like pushing air through wet rags. My heart rate spiked. My fingers tingled. The second it moved past, the feeling disappeared. I gasped like I'd been held underwater. Sweat soaked my shirt. After that, I tried avoiding it. I'd step out of the room around the time it usually appeared, go downstairs, whatever. The problem was, it didn't care what room I was in. Sometimes it would cut through the hallway instead, or the kitchen, or even the bathroom, always at that same angle, always slow and steady. Once, it passed right through the closed fridge door, illuminating the milk jug inside like it was a science exhibit. I asked the landlord if there were any floodlights on a timer. He shook his head. When I pushed, he sighed. "You're not the first to talk about the line," he said. "We had a tenant last year who swore a light stripe kept passing through the house. She moved out after a month. Any idea what it is?" I asked. He looked toward the dead lighthouse. "They say the beam gets stuck sometimes," he muttered. "Keeps sweeping the same spot long after the lantern's gone. This house is right in that path." I laughed because what else do you do? The beam came almost every night after that, sometimes touching me, sometimes not. When it did, the pressure got worse. My doctor said my heart was fine, my lungs were fine. Panic attacks, he suggested. Stress. One night, I decided to confront it. Probably the dumbest thing I've ever done. I sat in the middle of the room in a chair, right where the light usually passed, and waited. When it appeared on the far wall, my skin prickled. As it reached me, I focused on every sensation, determined not to flinch. The pressure slammed into me like an invisible freight train. My vision tunneled, my ears filled with a roaring sound like wind inside a tunnel. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. In that paralyzed moment, the room vanished. I wasn't sitting in my rented bedroom anymore. I was standing, or something like standing, in an empty lantern room, glass all around, sea black and furious below. The beam wasn't white here. It was thick, almost solid, a column of blinding light shooting out over the water. I could feel it pulling at me, trying to drag me along its path. In the distance, shapes moved. Ships, wrecked and half-submerged, their broken masts sticking out like bones. The beam pinned some of them in place. Wherever it touched, the water churned harder. Then I was back in the chair. The light was sliding off me, heading for the far wall. My chest heaved. Tears streamed down my face without me realizing I'd been crying. As it passed through the door, I saw something else. A darker shape outlined within the brightness, like a person standing in the beam itself. Their arms were stretched out, fingers splayed, as if they were pressing against the inside walls of a glass cylinder, facing me, begging. When the beam vanished, the shape went with it. I moved out within the week. On my last night there, I didn't sleep. Around the usual time, I went outside instead and leaned on the fence, staring up at the dead lighthouse. The tower was black, no windows lit, but for a second, just one, I saw a slice of light cut sideways out of the glass at a weird angle, like a glitch in a video. It passed straight through the keeper's house and kept going inland, scanning for something it refused to let go of. Sometimes, in my new apartment miles away, I'll wake up certain I've seen that same beam slice across my ceiling. There's no lighthouse here, no ocean, no tower, but if something got stuck inside that light a long time ago, I'm not sure it cares where the land begins or ends. 27. Title: The Emergency Light on the Cliff Path. The town turned the old lighthouse hill into a heritage trail with a paved path, benches, and pretty solar-powered emergency lights along the way. I liked walking up there after work. Quiet, good view, usually empty at night except for the occasional dog walker. The emergency lights were supposed to stay a steady, soft white. If somebody pushed the discreet little button on the post, they'd blink blue and send a signal to the ranger station. One night, I was halfway up the path when I noticed one of the lights flickering ahead of me, not blinking like an alarm, more like someone was playing with the brightness slider, bright, dim, off, bright again. As I got closer, it seemed to move. The light pulled back a few inches, then a few more, like it was hovering and retreating. The post itself stayed rooted, but the glow detached somehow, hanging at eye level in the fog that had just started creeping in. I stopped. The glow stopped too, hovering 20 feet ahead, right before a bend in the trail that led toward the cliff edge. "Sensor glitch," I muttered, even though these weren't motion lights. The glow brightened, then dimmed, like a breath. Then it backed away again, rounding the curve and disappearing behind a screen of scrubby bushes. Against my better judgment, I followed. The rest of the trail lights were steady and normal. Only that one glow moved, always staying just far enough ahead that I couldn't quite reach it, just close enough that turning back felt silly. "Okay," I said out loud, voice sounding small. "Nice trick. You got me." The fog thickened the closer I got to the cliff. By the time the trail opened into the lookout area, visibility was down to a few feet. The emergency light hovered at the very edge, a tight orb of white over the drop. I couldn't see the guardrail, but I knew it had to be there. My toe hit something metal. I stopped. The light drifted forward, out past the presumed location of the fence, hanging still over what had to be empty air. Every instinct screamed no. In the white murk below, I thought I saw movement, shapes surging and stopping like something heavy being dragged along the rocks. Without warning, the light blinked red. Not blue, like the emergency pattern. Deep red, like a recording light on a camera. It pulsed, slow and steady, casting a sick color on the fog. The air grew colder. Behind me, another light blinked red, then another. The whole path lit up in staggered pulses, like a string of warning beacons. I turned around. The way back was a corridor of dim red glows, the fog between them thick and dark. For a brief second, I saw silhouettes standing between some of the lights. Tall, thin, heads tilted, shapes wrong around the edges like their outlines had been chewed. I backed away from the cliff until my calves hit the bench. My lungs felt tight, like the air had thickened. "Help," someone whispered. It wasn't a dramatic wail, just a hoarse, cracked breath right by my ear. I whipped around. No one. Down below, the fog shifted. For a moment, I saw the hint of a broken railing, twisted metal, a dark, jagged shape that could have been a smashed car or a big piece of wreckage. The emergency light above the drop flared red, then white again, like it was trying to decide what signal to send. My brain flashed back to a local news story. Years ago, before the trail was updated, a car had gone through the old barrier in bad weather. The driver had called for help. They'd never been able to pinpoint his location in time because his phone kept pinging different towers. like he was everywhere at once along the ridge. The last thing he'd reportedly said was, "I can see the light, why can't you?" I'd always thought he meant the lighthouse. Now I wasn't so sure. I walked back the way I came, refusing to run, refusing to look behind me, even when I heard footsteps not matching mine on the gravel. As soon as I left the tree line and hit the first street lamp near the parking lot, the emergency lights snapped back to normal. White, steady, boring. I reported the malfunction the next day. The park office said their system showed no alarms, no unusual activity. "Might have been fog messing with your eyes," the ranger suggested. A week later, I walked the trail again in daylight. The spot where the hovering light had been didn't line up with the current fence. It lined up with a section where the old rusted barrier still clung to the cliff, twisted and broken, half buried in rock. Someone had tied a small bouquet of fake flowers to it. There was no name on the little plastic tag, just a date and 2 words: "Found too late." Now, when I drive at night and see those little roadside emergency call boxes or blue lights on campuses, I wonder what kind of signals they still carry, years after an accident everyone else has forgotten. And whether the people who pushed them the last time ever realized the light was leading them somewhere they weren't meant to go. Title: The Lighthouse That Turned Its Back. My family had a beach cabin directly across from a small island with a lighthouse on it. Growing up, I loved watching the beam sweep across the water at night. It never hit our place. It was always angled a bit away, crossing the bay and vanishing behind the dunes. By the time I was an adult, the lighthouse had been automated and then decommissioned. No more light, just a dark shape we were used to. One late autumn, I went back alone to close the cabin up for winter. The weather was terrible: cold wind, rough surf, the kind of night you stay inside and listen to the storm. Sometime after midnight, the power went out. I lit a candle and walked to the front window to check on things. The storm outside looked worse than it sounded, waves exploding against the rocks, rain slanting sideways. Lightning flashed, silhouetting the lighthouse in stark white. Except something was off. The lighthouse was facing the wrong way. I know how stupid that sounds. A tower doesn't face anywhere, but anyone who grows up looking at a particular building every day knows its details. Which side has the door? Which side has the biggest windows? Which way the little balcony juts out? In that lightning flash, the door and main windows were on the opposite side of the tower than they'd been my entire life. It was like the structure had rotated just enough to turn its front away from us. The next flash, it was normal again. I told myself I was tired, that the angle of the lightning was playing tricks. Then the beam came on. A thin, sickly light shot out from the lantern room and spun in a slow circle, cutting through rain and darkness. It didn't look right, too narrow, too dim, but it was unmistakably a lighthouse beam. I steadied myself against the window frame, heart thudding. Our town hadn't powered that light in years. There was no reason for it to be on. As it rotated, the beam passed over the bay, over the dunes, over the cabins, and then, when it should have crossed our front windows like it did when I was a kid, it jerked. Instead of completing a full circle, the light skipped, like a glitch in a loop. It jumped past our side of the bay entirely, completing its sweep only on the far side, like it was deliberately skipping us. The third time it did that, the candle next to me flickered and went out. The room went black, but outside was bright with storm and ghostly light. In the glass, in my own reflection, I saw something that wasn't there when I turned around. A shadow behind me, tall, thin, head almost brushing the ceiling. It didn't move when I did. It stood still, facing the window, staring out at the lighthouse. When the beam swept the bay again, the reflection's head snapped to follow it with this jerky, unnatural motion, while my own stayed frozen in fear. I backed away from the window. The shadow in the reflection stayed where it was, like there was someone else in the room whose movements weren't mine. Another flash of lightning. The lighthouse silhouette did that impossible rotation again, door and windows on the wrong side. This time, the beam, if that's what it was, didn't sweep the water at all. It shone straight back at the island itself, illuminating the rock, the base of the tower, the narrow access path. Something moved on that path, a line of figures climbing. They weren't lit like normal people. They were outlined in the same sickly light as the beam, like they were made of it. They trudged up the cliff, shoulders hunched, heads bowed, single file, all heading toward the door that kept switching sides. The reflection behind me lifted an arm and pressed its hand to the glass, fingers splayed. I felt nothing. No weight on my shoulder, no breath, but my chest hurt like I'd been holding air too long. The beam cut out mid-sweep. The silhouettes vanished. The storm outside went back to ordinary darkness. Power came back an hour later. I left at first light, cabin only half winterized. On my way out of town, I stopped at the little historical plaque near the beach. Someone had taped a clipping to it, a retirement announcement for the last human lighthouse keeper decades ago. He'd refused to leave at first, even after automation, insisting the tower needed a conscience. In a quote at the bottom, he said something I haven't forgotten. "You don't understand. A light like this doesn't just warn ships. It chooses what it wants to see. You don't want it deciding you don't count." Now, whenever I feel invisible in a room, like no one registers I'm there, I get a weird flash of that storm night window, of a tower quietly turning its face away from certain parts of the coast, and I wonder if some places, or some people, have been deliberately left out of whatever is still scanning the dark. Title: The Visitors in the Logbook. I worked one summer as a docent at a small lighthouse museum. The tower itself was off limits, except on guided tours, but the keeper's house was full of old furniture, staged rooms and glass cases. The guest favorite was the display of original logbooks. To protect them, we'd copied most pages and used facsimiles for visitors to flip through. The real books were locked in a glass case with a humidity gauge. One slow afternoon, I noticed condensation on the inside of the case. The first time I'd ever seen that gauge move. I wiped the glass, thinking someone had leaned on it, and saw something that made my stomach drop. The top logbook was open to the last page. I'd seen it before. It held the final recorded entries before the light went fully automated. The keeper had written dull notes about weather, one last shipment of oil, a complaint about seagulls. Now there was another line at the bottom, different handwriting, darker ink. The date column was blank, but under remarks, someone had written, "New visitors tonight. They say they know me." I flagged down my supervisor. She brushed it off. "Probably some idiot kid with a pen," she said. "We'll have conservation look at it." That night, I dreamed of the logbook, lying open in the empty keeper's house, pages fluttering even though the windows were closed. I woke up with the taste of rust in my mouth. The next day, the condensation was back. The logbook was open to a different page. Another line had appeared at the bottom of an older entry. "Voices in the tower stare. They know the names in the book." We removed the case from display, but it didn't stop. Conservation swore no one had touched the ink. Under magnification, it sat on the fibers like it had been there for decades. The new lines aged themselves overnight. A few days later, my supervisor told me to inventory the museum's digital guest book, a tablet where visitors could sign in, leave comments, stuff like that. I exported the entries, flipping through for anything weird. At the very top of the list, above the earliest digital entry, was one I'd never seen on the tablet screen. Name, H. Harris. Comments, "You let them in. You shouldn't have let them in." Timestamp. No date, no time, just a blank where that information should have been. I deleted it, or tried to. The app glitched, froze, then crashed. When it rebooted, the entry was still there. That evening, after closing, I decided to check the physical logbooks again. They were now in a staff-only room, still in their glass case. Someone had opened it. There was no sign of forced entry. The latch was intact. The key hung on its hook, but the case door stood ajar a few inches, and the top book had been moved. It lay flat on the table now, spine cracked wider, pages splayed. Every page I flipped showed the same pattern. At the bottom of an existing entry, in that darker ink, new lines had formed. Some were single words. Cold. Again. Downstairs. Others were full sentences. Don't write your name. He'll read it out loud. They think they are just visiting. None of you are just visiting. On the very last page, under the printed end of log stamp, there was a neat list of names, modern names. Some I recognized from recent tour rosters. Some were unfamiliar. The last one was mine. No date, no departure time, just my full name written in a cramped hand. I slammed the book shut. That night, the alarm system logged a motion trigger activation in the keeper's house around 3 a.m. The on-call manager checked the cameras remotely. No one appeared on the footage, just empty rooms, shifting shadows, and in one frame, the faint outline of a person sitting at the logbook table, head bowed over something. Their hand moved in slow, repetitive strokes. We chalked it up to a glitch. What else could we say? Ghost broke into museum to journal. On my last day, I went to say goodbye to the keeper's house. Stupidly sentimental, but I'd grown attached to the place. The logbook case was closed again. The top book looked undisturbed. I didn't touch it, I didn't open it, but as I turned to leave, a thought hit me so hard I had to grab the doorframe. The real logs had visitors' names in them sometimes, volunteers, inspectors, town officials. There was a pattern. Anyone whose name appeared more than once tended to have a note next to them in later entries. Stayed late, sleeps poorly. Here's them too. I had signed into the staff log every shift that summer. I checked the digital guest book one last time before I walked out. My admin account had a final message in the notes field, one I hadn't typed. Checked in. No record of checkout. It cleared itself a second later. The field went blank. I still get postcards from my old supervisor sometimes, fronted with a picture of that lighthouse, tourist-friendly and harmless. She always scribbles the same line on the back. Come visit. I never do. Because I have this gut-deep fear that if I set foot in that house again, the logbook won't just have my name at the bottom of an old page. It'll be open on the table, waiting, dark ink, ready to write the one word that's been left blank beside it all this time. Staying.